Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you isn't motivation, it's a wake-up call. In 7 days, your life can shift in a way that feels almost unfair. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you finally stop giving your power away. You stop negotiating with your excuses, you stop arguing for your limitations, and you stop shrinking to fit inside the small version of yourself that everyone else is comfortable with. 1 week is enough. Not for perfection, but for transformation. And it starts with one brutal truth. You are the only person responsible for who you become. For years, you've been carrying around stories, I'm not ready. I'm not strong enough. I don't have the discipline. Maybe later. You think those stories protect you. They don't. They build a cage so pretty, you don't even realize you're locked inside it. But here's the part nobody tells you. Change doesn't take time, it takes decisions. And decisions happen in seconds. The second you decide you've had enough, the second you decide you don't want to live on autopilot anymore, the second you refuse to let the world define what's possible for you, 1 week is enough to feel your strength again, real strength, the kind that's earned through discipline, not comfort, the kind that comes from doing what your emotions try to talk you out of. Because here's another truth, your feelings cannot be the CEO of your life. If they are, you lose, every single time. In the next 7 days, you're going to meet 2 versions of yourself. The one who wants to stay the same, and the one you were always meant to become. And only one of them gets to win. If you show up for just 1 week consistently, honestly, relentlessly, you will rise above patterns that have controlled you for years. You will show yourself a version of you that is sharper, stronger, more grounded, more disciplined, more alive. And that changes everything. Because once you see who you can become, you can't go back to who you were. You'll walk differently, think differently, choose differently. You'll develop a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need attention, doesn't need validation, doesn't need applause, the kind that comes only from doing the hard things no one sees. 7 days. That's all it takes to remind yourself of your power. Not because the week magically transforms you, but because you finally stop waiting for permission to transform. And here's what will shock you. You won't recognize yourself. Not the way you speak to yourself. Not the habits you tolerate. Not the weaknesses you once protected. Not the people you allow into your space. Not the limits you used to believe in. And when you reach the end of this week where you chose discipline over drama, action over excuses, growth over comfort, you'll realize something profound. You were never lacking ability. You were lacking the decision to start. Well, this is it. Your starting line, your moment, your proof that 7 days is enough to rewrite the story. So step forward, step in, give yourself 1 week, just one, and watch how unrecognizable you become. Transformation doesn't take time, it takes one uncompromising decision. And that decision is the moment everything shifts, often before your life shows even a trace of change. People think transformation is about routines, long-term plans, or massive steps that happen over months or years. But the truth is much simpler and much harder. Transformation begins in the exact second you decide you refuse to live the same way for 1 more day. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you feel ready. It happens the moment you draw a silent, private line in the sand and say, no more. That instant becomes the catalyst for every action that follows. It's not the first workout, the first study session, the first early morning, or the first disciplined choice that changes your life. It's the decision that leads to those moments. Without that decision, nothing begins. With it, everything moves. An uncompromising decision is different from the ordinary promises you make to yourself and break by sunset. This kind of decision is not emotional, not dramatic, not loud. It's quiet, almost unnoticeable, but unshakable. It doesn't need motivation to maintain it. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need the world to understand it. It's a decision made in solitude, in honesty, often in a moment of pure tiredness where you're exhausted from your own excuses. That exhaustion becomes fuel. You get tired of the version of yourself that keeps waiting for a perfect time, a perfect feeling, a perfect level of confidence that never arrives. You get tired of being someone who says one day and silently knows it means not today. And in that heaviness, the decision emerges clean, sharp, and absolute. Once that decision is made, something fundamental changes in the way you move through your days. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking, do I feel like it? Because the decision already answered that question for you. You stop letting comfort interrupt your progress. You stop letting fear dictate your direction. You stop letting doubt steer your choices. The decision becomes the compass, and every time your mind tries to wander back into old patterns, that compass pulls you forward. A powerful decision doesn't eliminate fear or discomfort. It simply strips them of their authority. You feel them, but you act anyway. You hear them, but you don't obey them. You carry them, but you don't let them carry you away from your path. The reason most people never transform is because they never make an uncompromising decision. They make soft requests. They make hopeful promises. They make emotional declarations that fade the moment life gets inconvenient. They confuse desire with determination. But desire is only the spark. Decision is the fire. Desire wants the result. Decision commits to the process. Desire waits for inspiration. Decision builds discipline. Desire fades. Decision holds. And until you make that kind of decision, your life will stay exactly where it is, no matter how much potential you carry inside you. When you make an uncompromising decision, you stop being interested in who you were and become deeply invested in who you're becoming. You stop rewriting your plan every time it gets difficult. You stop treating your growth like an optional activity. You don't look for shortcuts because shortcuts become irrelevant. You're not chasing comfort, you're chasing evolution. You're not chasing validation, you're chasing identity. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're trying to meet a future version of yourself who expects more from you than you've ever delivered before. Everything in your life starts aligning around that decision. Your habits shift. Your priorities sharpen. Your inner dialogue becomes more direct, more honest, less forgiving of excuses. You don't allow yourself to speak in the language of limitations anymore. You stop saying, I can't, and start asking, how? You stop saying, I wish, and start saying, I will. You stop saying, maybe, and start saying, now. That shift in language comes from the shift in identity. And that identity shift comes from one decision that refuses to bend. This type of decision also exposes the real battle. You against you. Not you against the world, not you against circumstances, not you against critics or doubters. The decision forces you to confront the habits, the patterns, the beliefs, the narratives that have quietly held you back for years. You begin to see where you've been enabling your own stagnation. You notice how often you let your mind persuade you into choosing comfort over growth. You recognize the ways you've underestimated your own capability. You see the gap between your standards and your actions. And that awareness is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Because transformation isn't about suddenly becoming stronger, it's about refusing to stay weak in the areas you've been avoiding. When the decision is made, you no longer need to feel ready. Readiness becomes irrelevant. You move because movement is required. You show up because showing up is non-negotiable. You act because action is the only path forward. You no longer operate from emotion, you operate from commitment. And that commitment, when practiced day after day, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's boring, even when it's exhausting, becomes the architecture of your transformation. People will say it takes months or years to change your life. And yes, the results take time to appear. But the moment that truly changes you, the root of it all, is that one uncompromising decision. The decision is what removes the old version of you from the driver's seat. The decision is what rewrites the direction of your future. The decision is what builds the discipline that shapes your identity. The decision is what separates the person who grows from the person who waits. The decision is the moment where your story shifts from who you've been to who you're becoming. Discipline, not emotion, is the engine that rewrites who you become. Most people live their entire lives driven by how they feel in the moment. If they feel inspired, they act. If they feel tired, they stop. If they feel afraid, they run. If they feel uncertain, they hesitate. Their entire identity becomes a reaction to passing emotions, as if emotions are facts, as if emotions are commands, as if emotions know anything about what they're truly capable of. But emotions are temporary. They rise, fall, shift, and disappear. They're loud in the moment but powerless in the long run unless you give them control. And when you build a life based on emotion, you create a life without consistency, without direction, without strength. Because no dream, no transformation, no meaningful achievement has ever been built on the foundation of how someone felt that day. It's built on discipline. Discipline is unemotional. It doesn't care if you're motivated or drained. It doesn't care if you slept well or barely slept. It doesn't care if people support you or doubt you. Discipline is neutral, steady, solid. It's the choice to do what needs to be done even when you feel nothing, or worse, when you feel everything. Discipline removes the debate, the hesitation, the argument between your higher self and your emotional impulses. When you have discipline, you don't wake up and negotiate with your feelings. You don't ask yourself if you're in the mood to take action. You simply act, not because you want to, but because your identity demands it. Emotion-driven people wait for the perfect moment, the perfect wave of inspiration, the perfect burst of confidence. They spend years waiting for a feeling that lasts only minutes. But disciplined people understand something different. They understand that feelings aren't reliable indicators of what will make their life better. They know that the work they avoid is usually the work that will transform them. They know that if they relied on emotion to dictate their actions, they would never grow, never stretch, never become stronger. Discipline isn't about ignoring emotions. It's about refusing to be ruled by them. When discipline takes over, your life begins to shift quietly but powerfully. You wake up earlier not because you're excited, but because you promised yourself you would. You show up for your goals not because you feel unstoppable, but because you refuse to be someone who quits. You make choices that align with your future, not your comfort. And every time you choose action over emotion, you teach your mind something important, that you are capable of controlling yourself, that you are not at the mercy of your moods, that you can move forward even when everything inside you is trying to pull you backward. This is where identity starts to shift. When you choose discipline repeatedly, you begin to see yourself differently. You stop viewing yourself as someone who tries and start seeing yourself as someone who executes, as someone who follows through, as someone who can be counted on, especially by yourself. That internal trust becomes powerful. When you trust yourself, you no longer need motivation to keep going. You no longer question whether you can do something. You simply do it because you've proven to yourself, again and again, that you can. Discipline rewrites your habits, and habits rewrite your life. When you repeat disciplined actions long enough, they become automatic. You no longer fight to make the right choices. The right choices become your baseline. This is where transformation becomes sustainable. Anyone can be motivated for a day, disciplined for a week, or emotional for a moment, but the person who develops the habit of discipline becomes unstoppable. Their actions are predictable, consistent, and effective. They don't rely on inspiration, they rely on identity. Their discipline becomes a form of quiet power that doesn't need to be announced or displayed. It shows itself in the results they create and the life they build. And it's important to understand that discipline isn't harsh or punishing. It's not about forcing yourself into misery. It's about aligning your actions with the person you are trying to become. It's about choosing long-term fulfillment over short-term emotion. It's about protecting your future self from the consequences of your present impulses. Discipline is a form of self-respect. When you act with discipline, you communicate to yourself that your goals matter, your growth matters, your life matters. You stop entertaining excuses that keep you stuck. You stop letting emotions sabotage your progress. You stop lowering your standards just because you don't feel strong today. Emotion will always try to convince you that you're too tired, too stressed, too overwhelmed, too insecure, too uncertain. Emotion makes everything feel urgent or impossible. It magnifies problems and minimizes possibilities. But discipline cuts through all of that. Discipline says, do it anyway. Not because you feel ready, but because you gave your word. Not because the path is easy, but because the outcome is worth it. Not because you feel strong, but because acting despite weakness is how strength is built. You start realizing that the days you least feel like showing up are the days that shape you the most. These are the days when discipline becomes your anchor, holding you steady while your emotions try to pull you off course. When you push through those moments, you build resilience, you build self-respect, you build mental toughness, you build a future that isn't controlled by temporary storms. You learn that you don't need to feel good to do good. Discipline also creates clarity. When you live emotionally, everything feels confusing. You're pulled in different directions. You overthink. You hesitate. You doubt. But discipline simplifies your life. It cuts away distractions, excuses, unnecessary decisions. It gives you structure, direction, and momentum. You know what needs to be done, and you simply do it. Emotional noise becomes background static instead of the soundtrack of your life. This is how discipline rewrites who you become. It reshapes your mind. It rebuilds your habits. It redefines your identity. It anchors you in commitment rather than impulse. It frees you from the chaos of emotional decision-making. It shifts you from reacting to life to leading your life. And one day, without even realizing exactly when it happened, you look in the mirror and see someone different. Someone stronger, steadier, more capable. Someone who doesn't break at the first sign of discomfort. Someone who doesn't give up when motivation fades. Someone who doesn't need perfect conditions to take action. Someone whose life is built on consistency, not feelings. Once you meet the stronger version of yourself, you can never go back to who you were. There is a shift that happens inside you, a quiet but irreversible change when you finally confront the part of you that's been waiting to rise. It's not dramatic, not loud, not wrapped in fireworks or applause. It's subtle at first, a moment of clarity, a moment of truth, a moment where you catch yourself doing something you once avoided, feared, or doubted. And in that moment, you realize something powerful. The old version of you was never weak. It was simply untrained, undeveloped, untested. The stronger version was always there, buried under hesitation, excuses, and outdated stories you kept telling yourself about who you were allowed to be. And meeting that stronger version isn't accidental. It comes from pushing yourself through moments you once ran from. The moment you choose discipline over comfort. The moment you choose action over excuses. The moment you choose growth over fear. In those uncomfortable moments, you feel the stronger version of you waking up. At first, it feels unfamiliar, like stepping into a new identity that doesn't quite fit yet. But with every action you take, it becomes more natural, more defined, more undeniable. You start seeing yourself differently. You start responding to life differently. You stop letting fear dictate your decisions. You stop letting doubt shrink your possibilities. You stop letting weakness be the loudest voice in the room. You start trusting yourself more, respecting yourself more, believing in yourself more. And once you've tasted that version of you, even for a moment, your old self becomes impossible to return to. Not because it was bad, but because you know too much now. You've seen what you're capable of. And once you know your potential, pretending to be small becomes a burden you can't carry anymore. The stronger version of you doesn't appear when life is easy. It appears when you're tired, but keep going. It appears when you're scared, but move anyway. It appears when everything in you says stop, but something deeper, something wiser, something stronger says continue. Every time you win one of those small internal battles, you unlock another layer of that stronger identity, and it changes you. It changes your standards. It changes your energy. It changes what you tolerate. The people who once influenced you, the habits that once controlled you, the insecurities that once limited you, they start losing their power. Not because they disappear, but because you outgrow them. There comes a moment where you look back and realize how far you've come, not in a loud way, not in a way that needs recognition, but in a quiet realization that your old problems no longer break you the way they used to. Situations that once made you crumble now barely shake you. Challenges that once overwhelmed you now feel like opportunities to test your strength. You don't react the way you once did. You don't fall apart the way you once did. You don't doubt yourself the way you once did. And that growth is the evidence that you've met that stronger version within. And once you meet that version, your boundaries change. You no longer entertain excuses, your own or anyone else's. You no longer tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, or anything that threatens your peace. You stop apologizing for wanting more out of life. You stop minimizing yourself to make others comfortable. You stop settling for less than the life you know you can build. You start choosing environments, habits, and people that align with your growth instead of your past. Your old identity becomes too small for you to fit inside it anymore. The stronger version of you also carries a different kind of confidence, not loud, not arrogant, not loud-mouthed. It's quiet, grounded, unshakable. It doesn't need to prove anything because it's built on proof. It's built on nights you didn't quit, mornings you didn't skip, goals you didn't abandon, and challenges you didn't bow to. It's built on self-respect earned through discipline and action. And when you walk with that kind of confidence, your energy shifts. You move differently, speak differently, think differently. You show up to life with more intention. People notice it even before you do. And even if life tests you, because it will, even if you fall back into old patterns for a moment, you never fully return to who you were. You can't. Because once you've met your higher self, your lower self becomes uncomfortable. You can't pretend you're weak when you've already proven your strength. You can't pretend you're broken when you've already seen yourself rise. You can't pretend you're powerless when you've already taken control before. The truth becomes too loud to ignore. You know too much about yourself now. You know what you can handle. You know what you can build. You know what you can become. The stronger version of you becomes a standard you can't unsee, a standard that calls you forward, a standard that refuses to let you go back to your old habits, old fears, old limitations. You begin to demand more from yourself because you've seen what happens when you show up fully. You begin to crave growth because you've tasted what it feels like to rise. You begin to see challenges not as threats, but as gateways to deeper strength. Most importantly, meeting the stronger version of you teaches you that transformation is not temporary. It's not a moment of motivation or burst of energy. It's an identity shift. It's a restructuring of your internal world. It's you discovering the parts of yourself that were hidden beneath doubt and fear and finally letting them lead. And once that shift happens, there is no going back. The old version of you becomes a chapter, not a home. A memory, not an identity. A starting point, not a limit.